first thing, I want to show you what you need to observe when you want to change. And the second thing is I want to give you 3 hints for 3 concrete techniques you can use, which are not the only techniques which they're around, and I invented none of them. I tried to put up the reference to from where I picked up what in the slides, so you will see from where did I get what. But I think they tie very good into each other, and I will explain why I think they are very well tying into each other. So the second reason I want to bring up why to do this talk is that we are doing one of the tools which are involved in these methods, which is a method called Specification-By-Example, and I will do a second talk where I go in detail about Specification-By-Example tomorrow. Just very quickly about me. I'm working in a fairly small consulting company, about 50 people. We're doing software development since a long time. We started to do Agile in about 2008. Mitch was the guy who brought me to that and who was training our teams initially. And we also started to learn that teaching our customers how to do software development helps us doing a better job in delivering software. So that's why we also do consulting and not only software development. All right, so the first question is, what's different with requirements when you start doing Agile? Why do you need to think about that at all? And I'd like to bring up a quote which I think very well describes why you should think about how to deal with requirements in Agile, by Russell Eckhoff, who said, if you want to solve, so successful problem solving requires finding the right solution for the right problem. And he further says, we fail much more often because we're solving the wrong problem rather than we are providing the wrong solution to the right problem. Now, if you think about a software project as of a problem you want to solve, I think this is very true for software projects. So projects are failing much more often, not because they are bringing the wrong solution, but they are solving the wrong problem. And while you probably might know that being at an Agile conference, that Agile is about understanding that finding out the right problem is what it's all about, and having a process which actually is aligned to figure out the problem as you do the project. What I find particularly interesting is that those who were writing down the requirements before were those who were doing exactly the opposite. So the job of a traditional business analyst is to figure out what's the problem before the team can start. They have to write down what has to be done. Now, if those people whose job was to write down and figure out what the problem is before somebody starts to work on it, get into an Agile project, it's a complete change of their culture. And that's, I think, one of the major challenges you will have as a business analyst, somebody who takes over the product owner role if you start doing Agile. You cannot write down everything up front anymore. You cannot describe the problem before anymore, because you understand that finding out the problem is a major part of the project, actually, and understanding what you want to solve. And the role of the product owner is, while understanding that you cannot know what the problem is up front, you have to manage somehow the process, you have to lead somehow the process. So you don't want to run blindfolded, start working on something and see what happens. But you should actually have some techniques that help you in this process of figuring out what you actually want to do. And the 3 techniques I want to show you are exactly for helping you in this process. So before I start with the techniques, I briefly want to talk about the role of user stories, because I see often people using user stories and not really understanding why they're using user stories now and why they're not using use cases still, which they used before. So who has been using user stories so far? And who is still using use cases or anything else? Okay. So those people who are using user stories should now help me explaining what's the difference. What's the difference between use cases and user stories, and what makes user stories Agile? So why care about the format? I remember when I started to do Scrum, I was a follower of use cases. I was convinced that use cases are the right thing to do in requirement analysis. And it took me, I think, 2 years until I understood why there is a difference between these two. So, what makes user stories different to use cases? Can anyone tell me any difference?
Stories are small.
They're smaller in terms of what? In terms of how they're detailed they describe, or in terms of scope they describe?
They can be either wide in scope and small in detail, or the other way around.
Yeah. So what is interesting is if you look at how a user story evolves over time in a project. Can everybody see that? Good job. Can you still see? Good. So if you look at the scope a user story covers over time, then as it goes to implementation, the scope will get smaller, so you will refine it. In contrast, if you look at the detail level, how much detail, how rich the user story is describing in detail, it will get from very low to quite high in the end. And I think that's one of the interesting observations. And this is an important tool. So if I look at user stories, if I look at things that are similar, yes, they are there to describe what features you need. Yes, you can use them to plan. But I think that's not what makes user stories the important thing in Agile software development. The things which makes user stories important is that you are aware that the user story is just an option. What you would like to implement, but probably you won't. Something you think might be helpful. And since you're refining it over time, and since you are adding detail only after some time, it's much easier to decide whether you want to have this option or not. A user story is also a very important mechanism to defer detailed discussions. If you talk with a user and the user starts to tell you what he wants, they will go into all sorts of detail. They will say blah, 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 everything they want to tell you. And you will say stop, stop, stop. A user story is a mechanism to say stop. I will listen later for that. Not I don't want to listen to you, but I will listen later. By writing down the user story and saying, yes, we put it here, we will not forget about this, we will talk about it when the time comes to discuss this in detail, we will not forget about it. That's an important mechanism what a user story is. And these are things which use cases aren't. There are some, I don't want to make a religious debate, so there are some people who are trying to use cases in a way like this, but if you look at the original idea, trying to write up everything up front, program on paper almost, that's not what Agile software development is about, and that's what you as a requirement analyst or somebody who deals with requirement has to be aware. And I think that's an important thing you should know before looking into any Agile requirements techniques. So knowing that, I think this quote from Kent Beck is quite well describing that user stories are the artifact which are at the heart of the continuing dialogue between what is possible and what is desirable. So they are the token you are using to negotiate what you actually want to do and to figure out until the end what you're actually going to implement. Now, if the user story is the artifact we have to use, and which is the right tool probably, and there is code we want to write, isn't that a little bit lightweight? But what can we do else? So I see people starting to write only user stories and getting lost in hundreds of index cards or having long, long lists of user stories in Excel where they are basically lost where they are and where they go. And three techniques I want to show you are helping you with different things. Depending on how easy you can define something up front or how hard it is to define it, there are different goal levels of requirements. So the more a requirement explains why you need something, the easier it is to make this assumption up front. The more a requirement tells you, or an artifact tells you, how you want to have something implemented in detail, the harder it is to define it up front. And some developers claim the real requirements are the code. Right? If I wanna know what the system really does, it's the code. And while this might be true, nobody can express the requirements in code. We need abstractions above code in order to figure out what we want to do and to resolve the ambiguity about the problem we want to solve. Okay? So what can we do about this? One thing I want to show you is a technique called story mapping, which will help you to structure your product backlog. And it's a little bit in a higher goal level. So it helps you to understand what are the goals and the outcomes of users and how to structure the scope of your system. Even above that, there is a technique called impact mapping, and Gorko will talk about this tomorrow, I think in the keynote, more in detail, which helps you to guide your project with goals. And the third technique I want to show you is a technique called Specification-By-Example, which helps you in the details figuring out what you finally want to build. So the user story is much more than just a single sentence, but all these techniques help you in this process of refining the scope and adding detail to a story as you are figuring out what you want to build. Okay. So let's start with the first technique, impact mapping. So whenever you build a project, what actually counts is not the list of features you're implementing. Unless you are a contractor who has contracted to a list of features, and you don't care whether the system works in the end or not. If you look at the stakeholders who are actually paying for the system, no matter whether they tell you or not, they have some goal in mind why they are spending money. And impact mapping is a method which should help you finding out why you're building a system. It's a method which is quite visual, and it's based on several works. One of it is called effect mapping, and yeah, Gorko has pushed this topic quite far. So I want to just briefly show you how you can use goals in a project to guide what kind of scope you actually want to build. So an impact map structure looks like this. You're trying to define why you're building this system. What are actually the success criteria on a business level of why you're investing money? Let's say you want to reach a certain sales goal for a shop you are building. Usually these goals are somehow tied to some financial reasoning. So if you ask why do I want to sell books, probably there's some strategy behind how you want to generate money, or you want to save money, like efficiency, or you want to protect money, like security. You don't want to lose money through some security, for example, which you want to implement. And what impact mapping does is it tries to figure out who can help you with this goal, or who can abstract you with this goal. Who can you address and who can you impact in order to achieve the goal you are having. Like if I want to sell books, I should think of who would be my customers, which I want to impact with my system, whose behavior I want to change in order that I succeed with my goal. And then you're thinking about different kinds of influences you want to take on your actors. What kind of impacts do you want to make? And these are, for example, in this case, I have to find reasons why somebody would buy from my shop, because I get it faster, the book, than I would get it if I go to the shop. And the next thing is the interesting part. Now you start thinking about possible solutions to achieve this impact. Like, well, I allow you to order online, and this would be the point where you would actually decide, I'll probably invest into an online sales product. However, it can be not only a shop which you could use to sell more books online. You could also say, I have a super fast distribution center, and that's why I can deliver a large catalog of books much faster. I can serve the long tail of shoppers, so I have a huge catalog which no physical shop could ever have, and I can serve this somehow through some distribution center. So making an impact towards a goal can mean different systems and even things which happen outside a software system. you can define high-level user stories for these impacts you want to make. So if you take the usual user story format, which you probably know, you have the person you want to, or the persona you want to impact. You have some impact you want to generate on this, so what, some behavior change you want to influence on this person, and you have some solution which will trigger this. Still, this is not a user story you would implement. This would be something very rough idea, which would be rather an experiment which you would like to try out and validate whether it brings you towards the goal you have in mind behind this. Speaking about the goals, there is a very good technique described by Tom Gilb about how you can define goals. He has written a book called Competitive Engineering, and there is a language he describes called PLANGUAGE, which is the acronym for, or abbreviation for planning language. And he is advising to define goals in a certain way. He is advising, you should, if you have a goal like, let's sell, I want to sell 10,000 books in the first 6 months, and finding this goal is already a business strategy question. But imagine you have this. How do you settle this? You have to define a scale, what you want to measure. In this case, the monthly number of ordered books. Then you have to define some meter. How can you measure this actually? In this case, it's quite easy. I will probably have, if I build a shop system, I will have some statistics where I can easily retrieve the number of orders. Sometimes it's quite hard to find out how to measure what you actually want to achieve. So you have to play with that. And then he's advising not to say just one target value, but he's advising to think about different values. Like, think about, is there a benchmark where you are at the moment? In this case, probably we have no shop yet, but there could be a benchmark where you are at the moment at this goal. Then he says, think about what's the minimum, the lower range you want to achieve. This could be either where you break even, this could be below that value you define it was a failure, things like that. And then think about a stretch goal, something which is the upper limit what you want to achieve, because you will not fix the value just as one value, but you will rather think in a range. And this is how you can define your goal. Now, you usually will not have only one goal defining the goal of your project, but you will combine goals with each other. Usually, I think of it like guarding goals around your main goal. Like, let's say our main goal is selling a certain amount of books, because that's our strategy, but we have some boundary goals around how much money we can spend on this experiment, and we want to make sure that there's some sustainability in the business we build, so we want to have some returning customer rate. So you can figure out that in most of the projects you have more than one of these goals which are somehow even competing with each other, and you have to find experiments and impacts that are balancing those out. I cannot burn endlessly money. I have to somehow guard how much money I can spend, for example. And after you have combined these goals, what you should also think about is that these are not one set of goals, but these goals will evolve over time. So you think about the roadmap, which will think about what happens after the next 6 months and so on. So this is how you do long-term planning. You don't plan long-term in detailed solutions, but rather in such goals what you want to achieve. Now, what you can think of is that such a map, which you can create then, is rather some kind of map of possible experiments which you want to do in order to succeed in business. And what I find in our daily business is that it's usually very hard to get access to this information. So what often happens to teams is that they just get presented with a certain experiment somebody has figured out above them without telling them, and they are just set on running on this experiment, and either their project will fail or succeed. And sometimes, if it's worse, people are not even aware that that's an experiment, but they say you must not fail, it has to work. Right? So what we usually do is, even if we don't get the customer to talk about these things up front, we try to reverse engineer this when we take on a contract. We try to find it out, which is harder because people probably don't want to tell that to you, and sometimes they even are afraid that you get some secrets from them. But usually what we still try to do is finding out somehow why are we building the system, because it will help us with all our decisions in clearing out this ambiguity which we have to clear out in order to build the system, since we know that at the beginning we actually don't know what the problem is we want to solve. So that was the first technique, and Gorko will give more detailed explanation or also some high-level stuff about it. The second thing I want to concentrate on is the technique, once you have settled on experiment you want to do, how do you get to a product backlog? How do you actually start building something, and how do you shape your product backlog and optimize that? And we found that story mapping is quite a good technique for this. It's not the only technique you can use, but actually I think it's pretty good. So how story maps work is they are now in this middle goal level, so they are explaining already how you want to do this experiment. We had our impacts, we had some very high level epic experiment, we tried to build this system and we hope to achieve a certain result with that. Now let's figure out how to optimize this experiment, how to use the resources we got for that properly. And this concept was brought up by somebody called Jeff Patton. Anyone heard of Jeff Patton? I think he's quite famous. And he's a user experience or user design expert. And story maps are really around taking this one goal and finding out how do I have to shape the experience of the user in order to achieve a certain goal, and how do I find out what kind of features can actually help me of achieving that goal. What you get with this is a technique which will tell you, which will help you finding out earlier whether your experiment is successful or not, and it will also help you to overview your product backlog. So how does it work? We start off with some high-level experiment, some epic which we want to build. So we say, okay, let's try to address the mainstream shoppers who are just caring about how to get a book as quickly as possible. That's our experiment we want to try out. And we said, we think the impact will be supported by a system which is the shop. And now we start to think about this specific user, how will they use the system? So what will happen in order to order their books? So I will think about, first of all, how they will actually use the system and not what features the system will have. So what are activities I have to do in order to get my book? So the first thing is I will probably search for the book which I do. So I think about the timeline and I really try to model some kind of flow, how the user will interact with the system to reach this goal of ordering the book. So first thing is I need to find the book I want. Next, I'll probably collect more than one book, and I don't want to order just one single book. Then I have to complete my order. I will probably have to tell where I want to have it shipped. I will have to pay probably, and so on. Finally, I'm completing my order. I wait for the book. Where's the book? Where's the book? Where's the book? And finally, I receive the book. I can unwrap it. I have it. So that's the process where I didn't describe a single feature yet. I just described the activities the user is taking in order to go there. And this is quite important because we're not decomposing functions, but we are rather thinking in the experience the user is taking in order to get towards this goal. Now, what we can do afterwards is we can brainstorm user stories or small features, more here, which are supporting these individual activities. So what can I do to find a book? I could make a very simple function where I can just browse the bestsellers. I cannot have a sophisticated, I don't even have a sophisticated search functionality. Or I can have a more complicated search. And you can have a lot of more user stories which are supporting each of these activities. So for each activity, you know what kind of system features could support it. Then you think about how important are these features in order to make the minimum walk through this scenario in order to achieve the goal. So you can order them by necessity. So you can say, well, in order to get from here to here, I have to at least be able to somehow select a book. I have to somehow enter my address, and somehow probably I have to get some delivery slip where somebody can pack my order. So that's the minimum I need in order to actually get this workflow done. And why this is so important? Because this is my walking skeleton I need in order to get the first time valuable feedback from my users. Because if you think of a map of your product backlog, and of course you have much more than these user stories, and you start building your product like this, the first time the user will actually give you real feedback is when you're almost done. If you build your backlog, or if you build your system like this, in slices, you will get much earlier to a point where the user can give actual feedback to you, and where you get not only the feedback, yeah, this is what we discussed last week, but this is really something I didn't think about. Let's rethink the whole process, and let's bring up new features which I realize I now need, and probably drop some features I don't need. And for this minimum walking skeleton, it's perfectly okay. This doesn't mean yet that you can ship it, but it's perfectly okay that you probably have some manual workaround somewhere, or you even omit steps in the beginning. And of course, you can use the same kind of slicing then. What's the minimum you can ship that people are actually using it? Using this will help you with two things. First of all, you will get feedback earlier whether the impact you want to make on this actor is actually working the way you were expecting it. And you can see whether your goal is reached or not. The second thing you can do is, this is how you can keep any deadline you want to keep. Because I'm not fixing the scope. I'm fixing the deadline, I'm fixing probably the budget, and I have this map which helps me that I spend the budget in the best way I can imagine in order to support the process. So when you run out of budget because you're done, you are not at step 3 and cannot support anything, but you have probably worked down several layers already in your map and have delivered already something valuable. So it not only helps you with the feedback, but also delivering something valuable, no matter when you have to stop. So I want to show you how such a map can look like in a real project. You will see not so much, but you will see it soon. So this was a voting system we built. It was about 300 person days, so a small project. And it was a project where the customer analyzed for a year what they want to have actually. So they discussed for a year how they want to have the system, they debated on the budget and so on, and finally, after long discussions and long deliberation, they decided to contract it, and so we built it. And in this map you see actually 3 flows. One was the nomination of candidates, one was the voting and determination of the results, and the third one was the provisioning and some support around the system. And we started to build the system. We built the systems in 4 sprints of 4 weeks. Unfortunately, we had only 4-week sprints, which was delaying feedback quite a lot. And this was the first sprint. So we just built 3 stories. It was really like bringing up everything, and we needed something which just exercises our infrastructure, and we get some first feedback and getting something running and to show. That's what we built in the second sprint. Notice how we work our way down. And that's what we built in the third sprint. And in the third sprint, the customer realized they had actually less budget than they told us initially. And what also happened is compliance came again and said, the things we told you in the beginning, you cannot do it like this. You need to introduce some additional security here. So after 3 sprints, we found out we are having only budget for a 4th sprint. We thought we will have 5. And we have to change something. Since we worked like that, we could this is what we did in the 4th sprint. And what we actually were doing is, these were things we dropped. Since we knew that they are down here, they are not so important features, we could drop them because we haven't implemented them until the very end. And these were things we added after the 3rd, so to the 4th sprint. When we finished the 3rd sprint, when we saw that we will have to change, these were things we added. And this was a project where the customer thought they know what they want. Yeah, they knew what they want, they just couldn't agree with compliance, what they actually need in order to be compliant, and they just messed up some budget stuff. So it was an internal error how they calculated the budget. It was not even a savings measure, but somebody messed somewhere up and they realized their order was not for the money they thought it was. Still, the project was a success. And I think the story map helped us here to actually carve out what is actually needed and be prepared to change late in the project still. So if you wonder how you work with such story maps, I advise, no matter whether you want to use an electronic tool or not, always start on a physical board. So this is a story map of a bigger project. So this is about 2,000 person days project, and this is a map which is covering around 60% of the scope. So each story here is at least 20 days of work. So this is a very high level map. And we use the maps also for designing. So this is in a sprint, in a sprint preparation, in a grooming meeting, in a backlog grooming meeting, where we figure out the details for the next few sprints. So we took the story map, hang it here physically. Here you also have the map, and here we design some states and some UI scribbles where we try to carve down the details, get more details, make the story smaller so we can fit what we want to do in the next few sprints. And coming to tools, I found two important things in terms of tools besides sticky notes. One is to have the right marker. And you might laugh because there are these markers here, which are too thick. So if you want to write something down on a sticky, it will usually not work very well. And if you use a ball pen pointer, then nobody will be able to read it when it's sticked on the wall. So there are some markers which have the right thickness, and I think that's an important investment to make if you work with them.
I always fight with them.
Yeah. The other thing which might be useful is this foil you see here. It's called Magic Whiteboard, because you can use it once you have done your map, and this is a, I think, 3 meters map, so the whole team can stand around. And when we were then taking it from the meeting room into the team room, because the team room is too stuffed to have all the meetings there, we put it on this foil. You see here is the map on this foil, and you can take it with you wherever you want. So there is no reason to have the map in an electronic tool in order to take it with you. You can conserve it. The third technique I want to discuss briefly is specification by example. And I discuss it only briefly because I will have a second session tomorrow where I go into details, and then you will also have a chance to try it out hands-on. But just to give you an idea what the last thing is about. The last thing is about the last step before you actually build the story. Then you have to enrich it with detail. Then you have to figure out what is really meant by that. And there's this nice saying, well, user story is a good reminder for a discussion we want to have. We want to defer the detail until the very last moment. Now, everyone knows acceptance criteria? Okay, so acceptance criteria is the last refinement step, which is known by most of the people. So how do I know that the story is finished? What are criteria which tell me that the story is actually doing what I want? Now, unfortunately, this is often not enough. Many people struggle with defining acceptance criteria. Some don't even know how to do this. And then there is another artifact which is also describing what a story should do in detail. Any idea what kind of artifact that could be? Bug reports. They describe very well in a formalized, isolated example how a user story should work. The only problem with it is that they happen after you code it and not shortly before you code it. So the idea of specification by example is to have something here before you get the bug report. I have seen whole systems re-specified in bug tracker when we finally deliver it. That's the most waste of time you can do. It's frustrating for everybody. So specification by example is a process which helps you in this last refinement step not to avoid all of bugs you can ever have, but to have significantly less bugs and have fine-grained specifications using examples, formalized, isolated examples, that tell you what you actually want to do to establish a shared understanding. So let me give you a brief idea of how this works. We work with examples all the time. So if you look at the user story, you usually at some point come up with some UI scribbles, some user interface design, how this should look like, or some screenshots you have of the system you want to extend. You have some artifacts which you want to either replace or where the user has whipped up something which he thinks how the system should work. Like if the user wants to have a report, they usually start in Word or Excel to show you what they want, right? They show you an example. And then you go to this example and ask, what is this? What is this? What does this mean, right? Sometimes you even go to the whiteboard. You cannot see it very well, but this is just a truth table where we discuss different types of examples and say, okay, in this case, what should happen? In this case, what should happen? Seldom the user can write down a mathematical formula telling you what the system should do. And if he can, then usually the developers are not understanding because they're working in a very high sophisticated mathematical domain. And unless they are also the mathematicians, then they have no chance of understanding this. So usually you're using not abstract formula to explain what you want, but you use examples, right? So, and this is the idea of specification by example. Brian Merrick was the first one who brought it up, and Goiko was one of the guys who made it quite popular in the last few years. And Brian Merrick said an example would be handy right now. He coined the phrase. And so what it works very well, if you want to explain something abstract, using an example helps. But unfortunately, we very seldom take the time to share these examples. So we use it in discussion, but then nobody takes the time to actually write down what kind of examples we discussed and how we can use them then to implement. And the idea of specification by example is saying, actually examples are very well for describing requirements, but tests which can validate these requirements are also consisting of these examples. So if you formalize them, they will get very similar as a last refinement step of understanding what you actually want to do. How this works is, when you discuss your acceptance criteria, usually business says something, what they want. And usually developers try to repeat what they understood, but business doesn't quite understand what the developer says. And similarly, the tester, of course, is blending into the conversation, and he's also saying something which the developers probably don't understand, and the tester and the business doesn't understand. So although we are using examples, we are not understanding each other. We are not taking the time to understand each other in examples. So as a last step of understanding it, the idea is to refine, in the end, a formalized example, which is in a written way so that business can understand it, but it's consistent enough and detailed enough that the testers can use it as a test and developers can use it as a specification to build something. And if you do that, and if you take the time to refine the details to this point, you will find out that you will find new things. You will be surprised that there are new things you haven't thought of yet. And you will find new examples which you have to discuss. So not only will this help you to remember what you discussed, it will also fuel your discussion about the details and will bring up new things you want to discuss. You should never use these scenarios to replace the discussion. It should always be just something which helps you with it and document it. Now, why I'm talking about this topic is because we are building one of the tools which can, it's an open source tool, so a lot of people are working on it, but we were the team who were initiating it on the .NET platform, which is called SpecFlow, which is allowing you to automate these examples. And so this collaboration is called the Three Amigos, because usually you have different points of views about these examples. Business usually thinks in a happy path. Developers usually think in a technical feasibility path, so they will ask about examples who are related to the architecture you want to support, questions you have to consider because of the way how you will build the system. And testers usually think in extreme cases. And putting these three views together helps in preventing later finding out that it's not what you wanted to build. So while these examples are useful for collaboration and finding out what you want to do, they have some additional purpose, I think. So the first goal was to find out what we actually want to build. But if you write this down, after some time, it will fade. Nobody will trust the text anymore, which describes. So you somehow have, wouldn't it be great if you would be sure that what you have defined is still valid? So examples can be used also as a documentation what the details of a system are doing, and they would be also great to continuously check whether what you have assumed already is still true. And the solution to that, or one possible way of doing that, is coupling examples with automation. So there are many ways how you can do it, and I don't want to say that this is the best way. This is the way we do it, and there is pros and cons for different types of tools. But I think the concept underlying all these tools is always the same. You have something which is business readable, and you have to define in your domain what is business readable. Sometimes this is code. In the domain where we are working partly with stakeholders who have no idea about software. They don't even know what their system does exactly. So we have to show them examples. Is this what you think could be right? And they are looking at this and trying to validate this. So for us, it's very important to have it in a readable format. When we have it in this format, each of these steps you see here, we can bind to some automatable interface of our application, and it becomes an automated test that tells us whether what we assumed here is still true. So looking at the documentation tells us this is still valid, we can trust it. You don't always have to bind this to or automate it through the UI. There's often a way to do it in a lower level, and I will talk more about this tomorrow. But you can also use it for UI automation. But the goal was not to UI automate your system, but the goal is rather to have the assumption you made already, the things you found out, ensured throughout the rest of your project. And if you do that, one important thing with the automation is, often I see people who try to implement automation into a system afterwards. That's the hardest thing you can do. So if you ever think about having automation in your system in terms of automated tests, do it when you build the system and not think of trying it, doing it afterwards. The worst mistake you can do. Good. Just a quick way how you can link this then together. So we are maintaining these maps then also in some tools where you can actually have the tool also in an electronic way while we still maintain the physical map. And we find then for sprint planning where you can have then all your task board and tracking. But what we also do is, if you drill into the details of this map, we have the automation bound here. So we can actually have the map as an overview for our scenarios to see what does the system do on a higher level. And then we can drill into the details and see the automated tests, which are basically telling us in a business readable description what our system is doing in a certain detail aspect. All right. So to wrap up, 3 things I wanted to show you. First thing was how to figure out what the problem is you want to solve and how to guard this with goals. Defining experiments which bring you towards your goals. which was impact mapping. Second technique I wanted to show you is once you have defined what you want to try out, probably that's the project you're working on, use story maps to drive basically the users through the system to design what you actually want to support, to keep the scope flexible, to carve out what you actually need, and to manage this throughout the project until the very end. Remember, it was in sprint 3 when we realized that we had to change, and we were having some room to change that. And the third technique, specification by example, how to settle on the details when you finally build a story, how to use that as a living documentation for your system to understand what you actually have built. Some books to read. I recommend always Wojko's books in these two things because I think he wrote very easy to read books which are giving very good references also to other techniques, especially in the impact mapping book. He is referring to both Tom Guild and also to Jeff Patton's story mapping. And probably you also know this specification by example book where he has been doing studies about teams who were applying this over several years. So if you want to convince your manager what will happen if you do this, have others done this already? This book is quite good for that as well. And if you're interested in tools, I have some flyers here which I can give you, which is describing the tools we are using. And I think I'm almost on time for questions. Thanks. Questions? Or